The man behind the counter held the badge under the light and said he could do $8. The veteran looked at the counter for a moment. Then he said, "All right." It was October 1961 in Kingman, Arizona, and the shop was on a stretch of Route 66 that smelled of hot asphalt and radiator fluid. The kind of block where a man could get a tire patched, a watch repaired, or his last good thing. Delbert Pruitt had walked in at 9:30 in the morning, with his hat in his hands and the combat infantryman badge in his shirt pocket, where he had kept it since 1953. He was 44 years old, and he had been in Kingman for 6 weeks looking for steady work and had not found it. He placed the badge on the glass counter without explanation. The man behind the counter set it back down and slid it toward him with 2 fingers. $8. Near the window, a man in a plain work shirt and dark trousers was turning over a used saddlebag with no particular urgency. He had come in 15 minutes earlier. He had not found what he was looking for. He was still there. Delbert Pruitt was from Winslow originally, the son of a man who had worked the Santa Fe Railroad for 31 years and died of a heart condition the summer Delbert turned 17. He had enlisted in the Army at 19 and went to Korea in August of 1950 with the 7th Infantry Division, 2nd Battalion. He was at the Chosin perimeter when the Chinese came in November on the eastern side of the reservoir while the Marines held the west, and he had done what was required of him in conditions that had no equivalent in any word he had ever found for them. He came home in March of 1951. He was 24 years old. He had frostbite scarring on 3 toes of his left foot and a tremor in his right hand that appeared when he was tired and that he had learned, over 10 years, to keep still by pressing the hand flat against his thigh when he thought anyone might notice. He had worked construction in Phoenix for 8 years after that. Framing, mostly, he was good with his hands and he was reliable, and the foreman on his last site had told him so directly, which was the kind of thing Delbert remembered. The site shut down in the spring of 1960 when the contractor ran out of operating money, and Delbert had spent a year following smaller work of fence repair here, a concrete pour there before the work stopped following him back. He had a room at a boarding house on 4th Street in Kingman. The landlady was a woman named Esther Vale, who had lost her own husband to the War Pacific, 1944, and who had let Delbert's payment slide for 3 weeks, without saying so directly, only by not saying anything at all, which was its own kind of grace. The 3 weeks had become 4. 4 had become 6. He had $22 to his name the morning he walked into the pawn shop on Route 66. The combat infantryman badge had been awarded to him at a ceremony he barely remembered, by an officer whose name he had long since lost. It was a silver rifle on a blue enamel field with a wreath around it, and it weighed almost nothing. He had not looked at it often. He was not a man who looked backward at things. But he had kept it in his shirt pocket for 8 years, and the keeping of it was its own kind of statement, even if he had never put it into words. He put it on the counter. $8. He looked at the $8 for a moment and thought about the 4 weeks of room rent and what $8 was relative to that, and it was not a thought he wanted to finish. The man at the window with the saddlebag set the saddlebag down. He walked across the shop without hurrying. He stopped at the counter and looked at the badge on the glass. He said, "What branch?" Delbert looked at him. Army, 7th Division, Chosin. It was not a question. Delbert said, "Eastern side." The man nodded once. He looked at the counterman and he said, "What did you quote him?" The counterman said, $8. He said it the way a man says a thing he is no longer confident is a reasonable thing to have said. The man looked at the badge for another moment. Then he reached into his jacket and he counted out $500 on the glass counter, and he pushed it across to Delbert. Delbert looked at it. He looked at the man. He said, "Mister, I can't take that." The man said, "You're not taking anything. I've been in this business 22 years playing pretend soldiers in front of a camera. I owe the 7th Division more than $500. He picked the badge up off the counter and held it out. "And you keep this." Delbert did not move for a moment. His right hand was pressed flat against his thigh. Someone near the back of the shop had gone very still. The counterman had set his pen down. A woman who had come in to pick up a layaway had stopped by the door and was watching without seeming to watch. John Wayne set the badge on top of the stack of bills and waited. Delbert Pruitt picked it up. The badge first, then the money. He said, "I don't know what to say to you." Wayne said, "You don't have to say anything." He picked up the saddlebag he had not intended to buy and paid for it at the counter and walked out into the October heat of Route 66. And by the time anyone said his name out loud, he was already at the truck. Have you ever seen someone try to give back what they'd earned because they thought the world had decided they weren't worth holding on to it anymore? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. Delbert Pruitt paid 4 months of room rent at Esther Vale's boarding house and had enough left to hold steady until the work came. It came back in January. A contractor out of Flagstaff was building a resort lodge north of Williams and needed framers who knew what they were doing. Delbert worked that job through October of 1962, 11 months, and at the end of it the contractor offered him a permanent position as site foreman. He had never been a foreman before. He took it. He worked for that contractor for 16 years. He oversaw the framing of 41 structures across northern Arizona lodges, schools, a post office in Seligman, a church in Ash Fork that is still standing. He trained 14 men over those 16 years, most of them young, most of them without a trade yet, and he had a specific patience for the ones who had been told in some quiet way that they were not worth the investment. He never meant it was just the way he ran a site. He retired in 1978 and moved back to Winslow, to a small house on the east side of town, within walking distance of the railroad tracks his father had worked. He did finish carpentry out of his garage until he was 68. His hands were steady. He kept the combat infantryman badge in his shirt pocket until his death in 1994. His daughter Carol found it there when she was going through his things, and she held it for a long time before she understood what it was, and longer after. She had known he had been in Korea. He had not talked about it, which she had always understood, without being told, was not absence but its own form of presence, the thing that ran under everything he was and never needed. She had not known about the morning in Kingman. She found out because Esther Vale, still living in 1994 and 91 years old, wrote her a letter after reading the obituary in the paper. Esther had been in the pawn shop that she had come in to pick up a watch she'd had repaired, and she had stood near the door and watched the whole thing and never said a word about it to Delbert in the 3 years he lived in her boarding house. Because she understood the way women of that generation sometimes understood things that did not need to be spoken, that to name it would be to diminish it. She wrote it down for Carol instead, 33 years later, in a letter that ran to 4 pages and a careful hand. Carol Pruitt had the letter framed alongside the combat infantryman badge. They hang together on the wall of the house in Winslow where she has lived for 20 years. The afternoon light comes through the west window and crosses them around the badge and the 4 pages in Esther Vale's careful hand, and then the light moves on, and they remain. John Wayne never told anyone, not to his director, not to his co-stars, not to any reporter on any set in any of the years that followed. Whatever he thought about that morning on Route 66, he kept it the same way Delbert Pruitt kept the badge, close and quiet, and not for anyone else's use. There is a kind of man who understands, without being told, that some debts are not personal. That the man behind the glass counter earned nothing, and the man who served at Chosin in November of 1950 on either side of that reservoir, in 30 below cold that had no name, is owed something that no country has ever fully paid. Wayne knew it. He had spent 22 years playing at it in front of a camera, and he knew exactly what that was worth and what it wasn't. He walked into that shop for a saddlebag, and he walked out having settled, in the only way available to him, a small piece of a very old account. He did not think of it as generosity. He would have been uncomfortable with the word. The badge never left Delbert Pruitt's shirt pocket, not in 33 more years. Not once. That is the whole point. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one, and every one of them deserves to be told. And unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.